Hello, hello. Thanks everybody for joining our ESG Fireside Chat discussion with Michael Rasmussen. Michael, can you hear me? How are you?
I'm doing really good, and it is a pleasure to be here today with you.
Yeah, we're super excited. It's going to be a different format, so hopefully everybody is going to enjoy it, and we'll move on to the agenda. So just before we
I'm
get
excited
started,
for this format.
yeah. Yes, we are too. Okay, so before we get started, just three things on the agenda. So this will be nice and quick. First, we're going to sit down with Michael and ask him everything about ESG and compliance. Then we're going to have a fun game. It's called Cards Against ESG, kind of a play on Cards Against Humanity, if anybody is familiar with that fun party game. And then we're going to end with campfire stories, some success stories that Michael has of ESG and how companies are handling it. Sound good? Okay,
Works for me.
so the first question, obviously, Michael, is tell us what is ESG, and more specifically, why do you think so many people are right now focused only on the E part of it?
Well, I mean, ESG is quite complex when you unpack it. I mean, at the end of the day, ESG is about the reporting of the organization that's required by stakeholders and investors and by regulations and laws. So we have environmental, social governance. Now, there's a lot of different reporting frameworks out there and regulations. Like the hot one right now that I'm dealing with every day is the EU CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. Lots and lots of interactions on that. But there's a variety of different ways to report in different regions of the world, and different stakeholders want different formats. So it requires that organizations have a good information and technology architecture that they can assess once and comply in multiple ways and report in multiple ways with ESG. Now, we've had ESG in the past. Before, it was called corporate social responsibility and sustainability. But the challenge is that corporate social responsibility was too often passed around the organization like a hot potato. And then it lands in the lap of marketing, where marketing comes up with a brilliant idea. Let's put green in our logo and think and show the world that we're a green company. That's not true ESG. That wasn't true CSR, corporate social responsibility. Yes, either. But the reality is that's what's happened in the past. Now, ESG has come in this last several years, and it has a lot of teeth. Investors like BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, they're making investment decisions based on ESG practices of the organization. Board members, they're being voted out if they don't hit ESG metrics. You know, your employees are making decisions on who they work for, not just on salary and benefits, but also on shared values. So are your customers and clients and prospects. And your third-party vendors, that's critical. I'm seeing a lot of interaction in that particular area of how do we manage the range of third-party risk. Like Germany's corporation supply chain due diligence law has a global impact. I was talking about it a month ago with organizations in Australia that were concerned about it. I've interacted with a large global pharmaceutical firm, not headquartered in Germany, but their biggest procurement risk that they're facing is Germany's law. There's a corresponding EU directive that requires all member countries to pass similar legislation to Germany. There's a lot going on here. But ESG, it was interesting. Back in November, I was the chair and keynote at the #risk conference in London. And they had a surprise session there. And it was the father of GRC meets the father of ESG. And so I've been called the father of GRC because I was the first to coin and use the acronym back in February 2002. But they had the gentleman that actually defined ESG for the United Nations and originally built that 15 years ago. And we both agreed that, you know, it should start with the G. That's where ESG does start. It might lead with the E because the environmental is sort of the sexy term these days. But it all starts with the G, proper governance of the organization. And we both agreed that GRC is how ESG gets done. You know, ESG is that framework and reporting, but it doesn't really tell you the operations and processes to do ESG in the organization. Now, you unpack the E, the S, and the G, and under the E, you get a lot of focus, of course, on the environment. That's what it's about. You know, and carbon and emissions and air, water, waste, pollution, use of natural resources. Those are all critical elements of the E. Under the S, you get all the social aspects. So you get things like inclusivity and diversity. You get modern slavery challenges like child labor and forced labor. You get privacy, because that's a social aspect. So if you're dealing with EU GDPR, California CCPA, all those elements, that's part of the S in ESG. Health and safety, and so much more. I sat on the Social Accountability Advisory Board for a Fortune 100 company, dealing with the social accountability issues with supply chain code of conduct and international labor standards like child labor, forced labor, working hours, wage and hour, health and safety across their global supply chain at 20,000 facilities. But that's all part of the S in ESG. Now, under the G, you've got things like internal controls over financial reporting, beneficial ownership, transparency, information security, anti-bribery and corruption, money laundering, sanctions, all that is part of the G. Now, when we look at the E, the S, and the G, a lot of people get misled because it starts with the E and they sort of get stuck on that E and think it's all about the environment, but it is so much more. Right now, nobody's figured the E out. No country, no organization, we're all struggling with the E. And so at the moment, this won't last indefinitely. The E is probably where there's the most forgiveness at the moment because nobody's nailed it. Now, on the other side, the G, that's where you have the most mature programs. And that's where we've had a lot of traditional G or C focus on anti-bribery and corruption and internal controls and information security and all those elements. That's the most consistent across industries and the most mature element. The S, though, is where there's the most risk currently. In the future, there could be more risk out of the E, but it's the S that has the most risk. If you have issues of inclusivity and diversity, if you have issues of modern slavery like child labor and forced labor, those are things that haunt your brand, not for just weeks or months, but years to decades. Whenever somebody mentions modern slavery, certain brand names pop up in our head from decades ago. And so the S has some of the most significant long-term reputational damage for the organization, at least today. The E might equal that tomorrow, but there's a lot of risk in the S. But the other challenge is that the E and the S, there's a lot of variance between industries and size of organizations. The environmental program or even the social program, at a large bank looks different from an oil company or a mining company. There's a lot of variation on particularly the E, but also some on the S. Or the G's, there's more consistency across industries. But the other challenge we have is, different cultures, particularly under the S, under the social aspects. How do you deal with, European and North American values in areas of the Middle East or Africa or Asia? Because not all the world sees the S the same way as we do. And how do you approach that as a global organization in many cases, addressing the S and showing your commitment to the S when there might be variants around the world where you have operations? These are significant challenges for organizations. So your question is, what is ESG? I think I've defined that.
Yes.
And why do you think we're only focused on the E? I mean, the E is the term that everybody's focused on. There's a lot of concern about climate change and things, but it's also, there's a lot more work to be done in that area. And I'm finding organizations slowly becoming aware of just how critical the S and the G are as well.
Mm-hmm. And that goes into my next point of, I know you talk to organizations with a ton of different backgrounds, enterprise, small, mid-market. There's some assumptions out there in the market that it's only enterprise organizations that need to care about ESG. Do you think that's true, or should everybody, no matter what your size, be focused on this?
Well, I think no matter what your size should be focused on this. Obviously, mom and pa's pizza shop down the street, ESG is not going to be front and center of their mind. But organizations of any significant size, particularly if you have 500 employees on up, you're going to be starting to see a lot of regulation and impact on that area. And particularly in Europe and the United Kingdom, you're seeing a lot of focus on ESG reporting if you have 500 or more employees. And so that's absolutely critical. But it impacts you not just from the size of the organization, but who you do business with. Consider Germany's Corporation Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. Organizations that had 3,000 or more employees in Germany had to comply with that of January 1st a couple months ago. That goes down to 1,000 or more employees in Germany on January 1st of 2024. But the reality is it requires ongoing continuous due diligence around E, S, and G, not just on your first layer of suppliers, but all the way down. And so that impacts you if you are in a German supply chain. So maybe you have 200 employees and you're in the automotive industry and manufacturing little widgets and parts for cars or something, and you're dealing with German automotive manufacturers. Guess what? They're going to be grilling you on ESG because they're required to. That means you're required to. There's a downstream impact on this in global supply chains, and in the EU directive that's going to require every member country to have similar laws. Similar law to Germany's comes out next year, and that's going to be significant. So, there's a lot of regulations that are impacting a variety of organizations, particularly those with 500 employees on up in Europe. And in the US, it's much more scattered. But the reality is if you have vendor supplier relationships with big companies, you're going to have to be doing this. And so there's a huge downstream impact. It's going to be bigger than GDPR. In fact, I remember one very small community bank in Illinois that came to me that said, we have to deal with GDPR because we have 2 EU citizens that are clients of the bank. But the whole ESG thing, it's going to have a bigger global impact, like Germany's law, because it doesn't matter where you are in the supply chain, you're going to have to respond to it if somewhere in that value and supply chain you're doing business with German companies, or soon to be any European company.
So, you're telling us about it impacts everybody. Here's all the things that fall under ESG. To a lot of people, especially in compliance, that sounds super overwhelming. So where can organizations even start?
They should start. Sorry about that. Just throwing my phone away.
You're fine.
But they should start with clearly defining their objectives. And so in that case, you need to reliably achieve objectives. And that's what's the function of it is to be able to reliably achieve objectives. And in that context, I see a lot of ESG solutions and approaches sort of backwards. They focus on ESG risks, but risks require context. And so if you take the ISO 31000 definition of risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. Risk requires context. So in developing an ESG strategy for organizations, it starts with, really understanding not what our risks are, but what our objectives are. What are our environmental objectives? What are our social objectives? Like, the environmental objectives might be carbon neutral. As one objective of many, our social objectives would be zero tolerance for modern slavery issues, inclusivity and diversity objectives, privacy objectives, under the governance, it would be the anti-bribery and corruption and all these other elements. You start with your objectives, what are the objectives, and then what are the risks to those objectives, and map that. But when organizations start with an ESG program, the very first thing I tell them is, what do your policies say? I mean, organizations have something in place somewhere. And so in that context, you have your code of conduct. Your code of conduct often tells you inclusivity and diversity and harassment, discrimination, and sometimes privacy's in there, and so many other elements. Organizations have anti-bribery and corruption policies. They have modern slavery policies. So when any organization comes to me and says, where do we start with ESG, the first thing I say, what do your policies say? You're from your code of conduct and your other policies, what are they telling you in ESG? And how do you go about addressing this in the organization and managing this? Are your policies a reality, or are they just smoke and mirrors? So now the other thing to benchmark is, do our policies reflect what we want ESG to be, or do our policies need to change? But to me, ESG is ultimately about the integrity of the organization. What the organization communicates to the world in its policies, its ESG statements, its statements by executives and management, what it states to the world, is that a reality in the organization? It's ultimately about the integrity of the organization. So the very first step is doing a good inventory of what our policies related to ESG and its different domains are. And does the organization actually follow those policies is the next question. And then what policies need to change or be added to address what we want from ESG in the organization. The policies around related to ESG, and there's many of them, they define what the objectives are for the organizations and also help you map the risks to those objectives.
Got it. I mean, it seems when you break it down so simply, it seems a little bit easier to bite off and digest. Yeah, that makes sense. My next question for you, Michael, is how do ESG regulations differ across the globe in the US, UK, and Europe? What do they look like now in terms of the approach that they have?
What do ESG regulations? Oh gosh. Well, Europe has much broader regulation in this area. And so that's where you get like, as of January this year, where the focus of compliance next year in 2024, you've got the CSRD reporting requirements, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And that's very broad, cross industries, and impacts a range of size of organizations operating in Europe. So Europe's got very broad regulation and legislation, and you see what's coming out of Germany with their supply chain due diligence. I mean, that's very broad. It's focused on the supply chain vendor relationships, but it's very broad in scope on what you assess there. The US, a lot of fragments and pieces. I mean, we don't have broad sweeping legislation and regulation in this area yet. You've got, the SEC talking about climate disclosures, but that's just the E in ESG. I mean, you've got, California's Transparency and Supply Chain Act, which was part of the S in ESG. You've got, Dodd-Frank Act with conflict minerals as part of the S. You've got U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act that's part of the G, and I can go on and on. And so there's not broad ESG regulation in the U.S. at this point. But there is a lot of piecemeal pieces to the puzzle of regulation out there that you have to deal with. You have those same pieces in Europe, like in bribery and corruption. You've got UK Bribery Act, step and do in France. You've got UK Modern Slavery Act. You got Australia Slavery Act. I mean, there's a lot of pieces of as well in these other countries, but it's really Europe that's taking this much more broader from a regulatory standpoint.
Do you see in the future that there's just a unified approach to ESG, no matter what country or what agency is setting those policies or regulations?
To a degree, I mean, to me, it's a lot like privacy out there. Over time, we're seeing some synergies in privacy, but there's still a lot of differentiation. I mean, but you take EU, GDPR, and California CCPA and CCDA, and what organizations do is they build a privacy program that can address both laws and regulations. There's overlap between them, but there's nuances between them as well. And so the goal is to be able to understand what's going on around the world, and how do we build an ESG program that can meet all of our global requirements, and particularly on a global basis. But there might be nuances in certain parts of the world that just don't fit, and we have to manage ESG a little differently there. But then that becomes a big question of integrity. Is that really the values of the organization? If you're going to modify things to fit into the Middle East a little bit more, or parts of Asia and things, I mean, that sort of hurts what ESG is ultimately really about, but that's also what's happening right now. But you need to take a global perspective and understand what's going on and be able to see these out there.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. It's very nuanced. So then that goes to my next question, Michael, of should organizations treat ESG regulations different than other regulations, or should they all just kind of have the same approach?
Well, to me, at the end of the day, and this is going away from a U.S. mindset in a lot of ways, is we can't see ESG as compliance checkboxes. ESG to me is really about the value and integrity of the organization. And this is also another big differentiation between the US and Europe. The US, we have this checkbox mentality to compliance. Tell me what I have to do. Let me check the checkboxes to get by. And then I want my get out of jail free card. While in Europe, you have what's called the outcome or principles based. It started in the United Kingdom with the FSA before it became the FCA. But you have outcome or principles-based compliance, and it became part of the EU's better regulatory policy, and it is across the EU and Germany. So in that context, you've got, here's what you have to achieve. We're not going to give you a checklist on how to achieve it. The one way one organization might go about it is different from another. So in that context, it's much more risk-based, and companies have to own it. And it's not just a matter of checking check boxes. It's actually, a more risk-based program in how we do business.
Mm-hmm. Our GRC director at ClausMatch, Eugenie Cashier, she has a lot of opinions on principle-based versus rule-based and which one is going to get you the better outcome. But I digress. Okay, next question. We've definitely seen here in the US media recently that ESG has become politicized by some lawmakers. Do you think that would impact the future of ESG regulation?
Most definitely. Yeah, it slows things down. And we see a lot of political turmoil right now. Myself, I'm seeing much more activity in the UK and Europe. I'm busier over there than I am in North America. And I've talked to several both consulting firms and solution providers in the space. They're seeing more activity in Europe right now. And part of that is, I think we're at a political stalemate. You don't have one side or the other, and I'm not taking any stances right now. Particularly this week of all weeks. But in that context, when we're at a stalemate, organizations tend to sit back and sort of wait and see what's going to happen. And right now, nobody really controls the U.S. government. The House is controlled by one side and the administration is controlled by the other. And so things aren't getting done as much. And I think that slowed down a lot of this. And there's a lot of speculation, like on the SEC's climate change rules. Is that going to be this year, or is it 2 years out before that's actually finalized and moving forward?
Yeah, no, it's like paralyzing almost, Okay, next topic. We've seen this again all over the media and in articles, publications. What is greenwashing, and why should companies avoid this approach to ESG?
I mean, greenwashing is essentially, making claims that aren't really true. That's my perspective of it. And that's why, to me, ESG is really about the integrity of the organization. A lot of ESG programs that I interact with are being led by the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer. And at the end of the day, if I could rebrand the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer, it would be the CIO, not the Chief Information Officer. We already have one of those. It's the Chief Integrity Officer of the organization. That what the organization commits to and communicates is its values in the organization. For example, I have a code of conduct here on my laptop. Back in the year 2000, it was the model code of conduct. Other companies were copying to be theirs. I had a petroleum company at my policy manager workshop in Minneapolis a few years back that said we nearly copied that code of conduct in the year 2000 to be our code of conduct. I'm talking Enron's code of conduct. A lot of times what we communicate is smoke and mirrors and not reality in the organization. And greenwashing, to me, is making claims that are unsubstantiated and misleading to the organization about your environmental practices, particularly because of the word green in there, greenwashing. But that same term, even though it has an environmental side of it, can be applied to the social aspects and the governance aspects of the organization as well.
Yeah, I mean, if it's smoke and mirrors, it will definitely backfire for sure. Okay, so you outlined how to approach ESG, where to start with it if you're a chief compliance officer. What kind of tech solutions have you seen on the marketplace that exist right now that could help companies actually manage their ESG compliance commitments?
Well, there's no one solution that does everything, because ESG is very broad and it gets down in the weeds. There's elements of technology that could, like when you book a flight with the travel agent, it calculates how many trees you need to plant to offset that flight to be carbon neutral. I mean, there's a lot of complexities in little pieces and niches of this. But first and foremost, to me, any good organization that is going to be addressing ESG is going to start with their policies. What policies do we have that relate to ESG? Because that's where our values are reflected. The foundation of ESG is built in your policies. I've said this time and time again, and nobody's been able to argue with me, because what our values are to ESG are all established in our policies. We might be missing policies that we need to be developed, but there's a lot of policies already in place. So you need good policy management to make sure that the policies you have reflect your ESG values and commitments. But then you need to make sure there's good communication awareness of those policies in the organization, as well as the third-party relationships, that policies that apply there. So to me, policy management is absolutely critical. The back-end maintenance of policies related to ESG, that singular portal and engagement on policies for employees. But then you also need to have good technologies that can manage the overall assessment and going out and sending out the questionnaires, surveys, those type of questions to different ESG objective and risk owners in the organization, and getting their feedback on things and where things are at, being able to monitor systems and things. There's a lot of workflow and tasks that are involved in the assessing of ESG. The other important thing is that you need to be able to have a good information architecture that can map our ESG objectives and risks and the assessments against that, because people report to different frameworks and standards out there. In fact, Deloitte had a report about a year ago, a survey report, and they had all the different reporting frameworks at the time, like GRI and others. And the thing is, it calculated well over 100%, because organizations were reporting to 2 or 3 different frameworks, because there's different stakeholder groups that wanted things in different ways. It requires you have a good information architecture that I can assess once, but it can map to different reporting requirements, and I can click the report button in this format or that format and work off the same information architecture, instead of introducing a lot of redundancy. To me, if you're going to approach this, you cannot do this in document spreadsheets and emails. This is way too complex to be able to manage that way. You need good technology to be able to address this. That's absolutely critical. The other particular important ESG technology is the third-party space. You look at Germany's law and the others that are coming out, require, or the SEC with the level 3 of the climate disclosure requirements. I mean, it requires, the supply chain and vendor relationships. So third-party risk technology is extremely important as well.
Mm-hmm. And finally, what industries are currently being targeted by ESG regulations? I'm sure there's many, but which ones do you see are the most targeted?
Gosh, I mean, it's really cross-industry. So that's one way to look at it. The larger and more global you are, the bigger the problem is. Particularly if you're in a very diverse business with a lot of divisions and things, that becomes even more complicated. There's a lot of focus in banking and financial services, even on the E in ESG and understanding environmental impact on like a bank's portfolio and assets. There's a lot in financial services, but there's a lot in petroleum and life sciences, and it's really a cross-industry problem.
Definitely. Anything else that you want to add on this before we get to cards against ESG?
I'm excited to see how this next section plays out. So I'm good.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so this is the fun part. This is the interactive part. Hopefully, you guys are up and awake. So this is cards against ESG. Hopefully those who are on the webinar are familiar with Cards Against Humanity. It's kind of a party game. Sometimes it's inappropriate, but we're going to keep it very PC here. So similar to Cards Against Humanity, we're going to have a couple of open-ended questions about ESG. And Michael, I'll get your thoughts on it too while we wait for some answers in the chat box. But we want to give the audience time to think about how they would fill in this card. And then it would be awesome if you guys could provide your answers in the chat box so that we can just see how you all compare. Ready? Okay, so the first question is, my biggest fear about ESG compliance is blank. Michael, what are you hearing that from some of the people that you talk to, some of the clients, companies, what's their biggest fear about ESG compliance?
A lot of times it's political silos, different departments that don't want to work together in a strategy. They sit back and say, I've been doing my job this way for 20, 30 years. I don't want to change. Leave me alone. A lot of times they don't want to expose how bad their internal processes and documentation are. I mean, that's one thing. I mean, the other big fear is changing regulations. What's going to hit me? When is it going to hit me? I mean, I see a lot of concerns on third-party supply chain and vendor relationship because of regulations. And so there's a variety of answers here. Another big fear is, trying to manage this in manual processes with documents, spreadsheets, and emails, which I categorize as the inevitability of failure.
Yeah. No, I'm seeing a bunch of responses in the chat box. Thanks so much for everybody for participating. Some of them are, like you said, drowning under data management and the burden of that. Chaos is another just knee-jerk response, not being taken seriously, excessive reporting. I'm also seeing starting a very burdensome process with a no tangible outcome, as in this is just going to be ongoing. So it's hard to even know where to start and motivate people to take it seriously. Another one, tick the box for sure. Lack of knowledge and measurement of ESG metrics. Any response to those that stick out to you, Michael?
Gosh. I mean, they all sort of stick out to me. I'm like looking at them again here, but gosh, I mean, I could comment on every one of these. But I mean, the tick box exercise, to me, that is a huge fear, that it just becomes more of a compliance exercise instead of a real integrity and value exercise. ESG is only going to work in an organization if it's actually how it operates and its actual values. It's at its core. I mean, there's also the lack of knowledge and measurement of ESG metrics and scale of different regulatory regimes. I mean, these are all really good fears that line up with a lot of what I was just saying. Yes.
Definitely. Okay, let's move on to the next card. Okay, this one, after I tackle blank, I will start thinking about ESG compliance. So it's again trying to prioritize ESG. It's trying to situate yourself and your organization. So what would people think in the audience of after I tackle blank, I will start thinking about ESG compliance? Any comments on this one so far, Michael? Of what you hear of, oh, I've got to do this first before I actually do compliance.
I mean, this is a mindset of tactical and not strategic thinking about ESG. And so a lot of times it might be, addressing some latest risk assessment or something that's got to get done and just putting it in line of the myriad of other tasks we got to get done. But the reality is that ESG is really a top-down driven initiative. And so in that context, there's a lot of boards that are taking a lot of involvement in this, because in some cases, they can be voted out if they don't hit ESG metrics. And corporate investors are requiring this. And so this has got more board attention than a lot of other regulations have in the past. And so so you need to be thinking about this strategically. But this whole question to me is much more tactical thinking about ESG, where it's just being put on a shelf with all the other regulations that we have to deal with. And once I have time, I'm going to get to it. But a lot of times the boards are pushing this to the front of the agenda.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm seeing some responses. Staff ESG awareness, business requirement, cost management, definitely a big one. Buy-in, regulatory requirement expansion, just trying to understand what do we need, what regulations do we have to meet now as we expand. I mean, totally get that. That's a huge, daunting task. But yeah,
okay.
All right,
yeah.
next.
So some of these are interesting because I really like the question on ESG awareness, because that's actually reading the question very literally, because before I can really start thinking about ESG compliance, I've got to do education on ESG and define its scope. So I like that answer, because it's taking that question very literally, and not just a blanket, we'll start ESG, but we'll start ESG compliance after we focus on awareness. I found that one to be a rather interesting answer.
Yeah, definitely making the checklist of A goes first, then B, and then, just step by step. Okay, last card. Okay, in order to create an ESG framework for my organization, I need blank and blank. Any thoughts on this, Michael, first, before we get some panelists or some responses?
Well, to me, in order to create an ESG framework for my organization, I need blank and blank. I would need to understand my policies currently and what my ESG objectives are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you outlined that while we were talking about, ESG, how to approach it, where to even start.
Somebody just mirrored that too in one of their answers. They weren't listening.
Buy-in and resources. Resources is a huge one, right? It's, you can't just snap your fingers and they're the ESG policies and procedures and approach appears. You have to have staff as well. I get it.
And now I don't like this answer, but the reality for a lot of organizations, particularly a lot of US organizations, I would say the answer is, in order to create an ESG framework for my organization, I need to see real fines and penalties.
Yeah.
Because that's when organizations start taking things seriously. I remember back in 1996, I was an IT security consultant and HIPAA came out. And I was telling all these hospitals that you have to be HIPAA compliant to the privacy and security requirements of HIPAA. And they laughed at me. It wasn't until 2006, a decade later, that they started taking HIPAA seriously. Why? Because that's when there started to be financial penalties and enforcement on it. It was a decade after the law regulation came out. And unfortunately in the US, that's also where I see a lot of this happen, is that in order to create an ESG framework for my organization, I need to see fines and penalties.
Isn't that so interesting? It's like, well, why don't you prevent that? Try to be ahead of the curve, try to be proactive instead of reactive. Okay, thanks everybody for responding. I see that you are awake. You are hopefully enjoying the webinar. Okay, last part of this is the campfire stories. So we're not literally next to a campfire, unfortunately, but going to try to situate it that way. Michael, I would love to hear from you. Again, you have so much experience. You talk to dozens of companies and consultants and people every day about ESG, about GRC. Could you please just give an example of a success story of how companies are already handling ESG?
I mean, in one case, I can think of an organization, and I can't really name names specifically, but of where the executive leading the program actually is sitting down with senior management from board and executives, as well as the operational parts of ESG, and sits down with each of them, and it clearly maps the objectives, the ESG objectives that they have to be achieved, what the objectives are that they're being measured by, and then working through a workshop with them on what are the risks to those objectives, and then providing them, whether it's monthly or quarterly or semi-annual type reports that monitor those objectives and the risks to those objectives, to give them a lot of contextual information. To me, that's critically important. I get frustrated when people start with ESG risks and not ESG objectives, because risks are the effect of uncertainty on objectives. You can't have a risk without objectives. And you need to clearly define what your ESG objectives are. What are you trying to achieve? And then what are the risks to achieving that? Focusing on the risks is putting the cart before the horse. Now, campfire stories, I mean, I talked about that one organization. Campfire stories also can tend to be horror stories as well.
Yeah.
Scary stories. In one context, I remember reviewing a supply chain code of conduct for a large global organization that goes out to tens of thousands of suppliers. And at the time, it's changed since then. But when I reviewed it, I was amazed, because this is all primarily dealing with the S in ESG, around things like modern slavery and child labor, forced labor, that is, and working hours and wage and hour and health and safety in facilities. And this code of conduct was written largely in the passive voice with long paragraphs, and was only published in English as it was going out to international audience. And the first paragraph says company believes, the second paragraph says company strongly believes. So you have different levels of belief in the supply chain code of conduct, all related to ESG. I mean, because somebody that has English as a native language might read past that word strongly in the second paragraph, but somebody that has English as a second language is going to see that word strongly and say, this paragraph's more important in the first. The whole thing was written rather carelessly, and not thoughtfully. And so they've changed it since then. But, to me, if you're really going to embrace this, you're going to make your policies and your communication awareness of those policies very relevant to the organization and make it part of the culture of the organization. It's absolutely critical.
Are you seeing any companies totally embrace the role of technology with this as well? Any success stories that way?
Definitely, yeah. But again, there's no one solution that does everything ESG. There's a lot of pieces and niches to it. And so some organizations are doing very well with that policy management, platform like a clause match, to be able to have that centralized platform to be able to map our broad ESG policies and our very specific niche ESG policies and provide that portal to communicate and engage. Others are delivering really good technology to build out very comprehensive programs on that third-party risk assessment and that ongoing continuous due diligence on ESG in our supplier and vendor relationships.
Yeah.
And then there's technology that's being leveraged for that ongoing assessment and the questionnaires and things that we're sending out internally to build out our gather information to build our ESG reports from.
Yeah. I mean, there's, like you said, there's not a solution out there that's a one size fits all that totally encompasses everything, but technology can definitely get you there if you know the right solutions and have, again, the right framework, the right mindset to that approach. Anything else on this topic before we wrap up, Michael?
That's pretty much everything from my perspective. I mean, again, I just reiterate that doing this right, it's not a tick box exercise. It's really about the integrity of the organization, what its values are, and how is that reflected throughout our operations and relationships.
Definitely. Okay. Before we say goodbye, we have this beautiful mug to raffle off to some of the participants. The raffle winners so far are Amanda Frazier, Brent Dove, Linda Moody, Lori Rogers, and Ross Adams. So we will be getting in touch with you on how we're going to send those out. I can attest this coffee mug is very nice. It is very large and it retains the heat and it's beautiful. So congratulations to the winners. Okay. And then we want to thank you guys for attending. There is a QR code for our future ESG related events that are later this month. It's part of our Spring Fest. It deals with Earth Day, which is later this month as well. Thank you so much, Michael, for joining. Appreciate all your insights. And we're going to wrap up. Thanks, everybody. We're going to post this webinar on YouTube later today, and you'll get an email for that link. Thanks, everyone.